My name is Michael Bowie. I'm the vicar here, and I'm also here to, before I welcome Dorothy, to just point out to you that there are programs for the rest of the series available at the back of church, as well as on your handout tonight, a note of the next session about Les Murray. It's a great pleasure to have Dorothy Lee with us again tonight. Dorothy is Professor Emerita at Trinity College in the University of Divinity and an Anglican priest. Her research has focused particularly on literary approaches to the Gospels. She has a keen interest in 19th century women's writing. She lectured at Trinity for nearly 17 years in New Testament and is currently writing a commentary on the poetics of John's Gospel. Among her publications are a book on the ministry of women in the New Testament, and her most recent book is on the themes of John's Gospel. She's also a published poet and a much-loved honorary assistant priest in this parish. Dorothy is also a member of the committee that's organising this series of talks, and I'm especially delighted that she's speaking to us about Emily Dickinson, as I chose the poet for tonight. I'm tempted to add, paraphrasing the end of St. John, that there are many other things which Dorothy has done, and if every one of them were written down, I suppose the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. But that wouldn't be quite true, so I won't say that. Dorothy, welcome.
Thank you very much for your introduction, Michael, and the reference to John 21 was particularly appreciated. So I want to talk to you tonight about Emily Dickinson, thanks to Michael's suggestion. And you'll find the handout here a couple of mistakes on it that are not Naomi Johnson's, who has done an absolutely wonderful job in spite of me, but are entirely mine, but we'll come to those. So what I want to do this evening is to make some general remarks and then to look at half a dozen or so of the poems, depending on how much time we get. If Michael waves at me to shut up, I will stop. So just by way of introduction, just a few points. Let me say that I've not always loved Emily Dickinson. She's a poet I found difficult to connect to, not just because some of her poems are difficult and some of them are, but I just found her a little bit alienating, a little bit too American, a bit too romantic, a whole lot of adjectives that I have now firmly thrown out. But I did actually come to a point, almost happened almost like a conversion experience, where I suddenly thought, I'm inside this poem now. And once you're inside, you know you love the poet and you want to read more. So that was certainly my conversion narrative, if you like, with Emily Dickinson. So I'm focusing tonight on her poetry and not her life. That doesn't mean, of course, we should ignore her life or her context, but my main focus will be on the poems themselves. Because I think any insights from her context, from her life, are there to illuminate the poems and not the other way around. Poetry is sometimes read through the lens of biography, but I'm well aware of T.S. Eliot's criticisms of that approach. And because I'm in the Gospel of John and we don't know who wrote it, that means I'm not too fussed about somebody's life. So we don't read the poems to get to her life. And that's not what I'm going to do. And that means that the eye of the poems is not necessarily to be equated with the poet. Sometimes yes, sometimes no, not necessarily. In one poem, for example, the speaker of the poem is a gun. In another, it's someone who died centuries ago. So you can't necessarily equate, this is not confessional poetry, this is not Sylvia Plath. So therefore we need to be careful that we are speaking of the speaker, the poet, rather than Emily Dickinson, although of course there's a profound overlap. Emily Dickinson wrote nearly 1,800 poems throughout her life, which went from 1830 to 1886. She lived in Amherst, Massachusetts, of a middle-class family, and she was congregational, and that's important. She was from, in other words, the Reformed tradition, which is somewhat different from the Presbyterian tradition in that it sees each congregation as separate in itself and sort of self-ruling. But it was definitely, in her day, Calvinistic, strongly Calvinistic. And there had been in her youth a whole number of revivals, religious revivals. So Calvinism had been infused by something of the spirit of evangelicalism. They're not incidentally the same thing, but they certainly overlapped here. And of course, Dickinson famously resisted the calls for revival. She was, however, given a Bible at the age of 13, and she was very well versed in it, as I think you'll see from her poetry. She's also writing during the period of the American Civil War, which was 1861 to 65. First and foremost, she was a poet. In fact, she was nothing but a poet. She was also a friend and a whole lot of other things, but professionally speaking, she was a poet. Very passionate, very intense, but also profoundly introverted and reclusive. Her poetry is a funny sort of amalgam. It's part of the late Romanticism of the 19th century with its focus on nature, but it also verges on early modernism in some ways. It breaks conventions, it can be fragmented. But there are traces also of the movement in the US, in American philosophy called transcendentalism, which went through most of the 19th century, which was belief in a high sense of spirituality without organised religion. It was focused on nature, on the autonomy of the individual, and in some ways it was quite close to Unitarianism, the Unitarian Church, which is not generally recognised to be Christian because it's not Trinitarian. But transcendentalism was quite close in some ways to Unitarianism. If you're familiar with Little Women and the novels of Louisa May Alcott, she was a transcendentalist and a Unitarian. The spirituality of Emily Dickinson's poetry is complex. It's ambiguous. It's daring. It defies conventions, especially the conventions of her day. It defies neat categories. It can be quite subversive. And so we find a combination of kind of spiritual depth and rebellion, believing and doubting, a strong focus on wisdom as well as, of course, as nature. But there's no real consistent spirituality or theology that I think emerges. There are signs of it, and I'll make a few points at the end about her theology, about her spirituality, but she's not necessarily consistent, and I don't see why a poet has to be anyway. But the poems don't necessarily, some of them contradict each other, and I don't think she cares about that, and I don't think we should either. Emily Dickinson wasn't published during her lifetime, except for a kind of self-publishing in two ways. One, she wrote some of her poems to friends in letters, and also she made little books called fascicles, little books that she sewed pieces of paper together. She punched a hole and sewed them together with kitchen string. And she made about 40 of those with poems in them. Other periods she didn't do that, but that was her own, presumably for herself, but she was not actually published. She was published soon after her death by, mainly through her sister, and I have here a copy of the first two editions. It is a copy, of course, of the original editions of the poetry, which were put together by two friends of hers who were really desperate to get her poems out there. But the interesting thing is that they standardise her spelling, her syntax, and so on in a way that we wouldn't do so now. So in other words, she never prepared her poems for official publication. And even in the fascicles, I find that word very hard to say. Fortunately, I haven't drunk anything yet. But in these fascicles, she sometimes puts alternatives in the margins. So presumably she would have maybe resolved that if she had been prepared to publish. Her most productive years were probably between about 1858 and 1865. She has a unique style of writing, as I think you'll all know just to glance at any of her poems. There are no titles for the poems. I've put those titles in just so that we don't get lost, and they're just the first line of the poem. The spelling could be erratic. She spells veil, V-A-I-L, instead of V-E-I-L. Sometimes words like don't, she has D-O''N-T. She has all these things. She capitalises randomly, perhaps more, sometimes important words, but sometimes it's hard to see why the word is capitalised. Her punctuation is also, sometimes there is none, sometimes there's more punctuation, but the most important thing about her is, a noticeable thing, is her dashes, which she has in every line of most poems, which this edition lacks. There are occasional dashes, but only very occasional ones, the characteristic dashes. So the lines in this first edition are smoothed out obviously for publication purposes. The classical edition is now generally considered to be R.W. Franklin's, and he has actually organised the poems year by year with some undated poems at the end. And I'm using his edition to talk about these poems. So the numbers actually do relate to his edition, so just ignore those numbers, they're really not important. Okay, let's have a look at some of the poems. I thought we'd start with Tell All the Truth, but Tell It Slant. So I'm not quite sure what number that is in this. 3, thank you. Number 3. Which was written in about 1872. I'll read it first and then just spend a few minutes on it. Tell all the truth, but tell it slant. Success in circuit lies, too bright for our infirm delight, the truth's superb surprise. As lightning to the children eased with explanation kind, the truth must dazzle gradually, or every man be blind. Now this is an octet, 8 lines, with a very simple rhythm. I don't know if you're very wildly into rhythm, but tetrameter is 4 feet in the line, 4 kind of beats, if you like, in the line, alternating with trimeter, which is 3 beats in the line. And there's a rhyme at the end of every second line. She's not too fussy about strict rhyming. She can be quite loose with rhymes. Lines 1 to 2 says that, obviously, that the truth must be told sideways, side on, in a roundabout way, not full on. It's best confronted gradually, in a circular way, coming at it from the side. And this is because, she goes on to say in lines 3 and 4, because of our weakness, even in our joy at confronting truth, our infirm delight, what a beautiful phrase that is, our infirm delight. It will come to us that way as surprise, superb surprise of truth will come to us sideways, gently, gradually, side on. And then verses 5 to 6, we have the image of explaining to a child about lightning so that they're not afraid of it. Explaining what it is, or finding a way of saying it's not going to hurt you. Gently explaining to a child, otherwise the child is frightened. And that's what we have to do with truth. We have to assure ourselves, we have to be assured that it's not going to terrify us. Lines 7 to 8, its reality needs to be gently revealed, otherwise it will overwhelm us, it will blind us, it must dazzle gradually. Well, this is a beautiful poem, but and a fairly simple and self-explanatory poem, but it's also subversive. On the one hand, it firmly asserts the reality of truth. It's not relativistic. It's not saying there's no such thing as truth. It believes in truth, but it implicitly denies the propositional nature of the Calvinism of her day, which was based on truthful propositions to which you had to give your assent, and a whole lot of them about every aspect of the Bible and of church tradition, of spirituality, of worship, and so on. Indeed, it implies that truth brings delight, beauty, illumination, when it is told to us gently, kindly, slowly. And this is not just a question of Calvinist truth, but questions the very nature of that truth, of the truth of Calvinism, the truths of Calvinism. Calvinism is generally, whether Calvin was a Calvinist is another question I won't go into, but Calvinism generally is suspicious of beauty, sees beauty as dangerous, as seductive, as misleading. And of course, she entirely resists that. She sees truth as something that's delightful, that's a superb surprise, that enchants, that delights. And so, and she equates truth also with wisdom. So here, although she's speaking about truth, she's doing it in quite a subversive way, and a very, I think, winsome way of talking about what truth is. And then the poem that is the title of today's lecture, and I'm looking at 3 poems on faith, hope and love. I'm sorry I couldn't resist that as a New Testament scholar, but that's not necessarily her thing. But the poem Faith is the Pierless Bridge is, I think, a fascinating poem. Let me read it to you. Faith is the peerless bridge supporting what we see unto the scene that we do not, too slender for the eye. It bears the soul as bold as it were rocked in steel, with arms of steel at either side. It joins, behind the veil, to what, could we presume, the bridge would cease to be, to our far vacillating feet, a first necessity. So here we've got 3 stanzas, 3 quatrains, with a 3-3-4-3 pattern. 3 feet in the first 2 and last lines, 4 feet in the middle line, the third line, so that the third line is elongated, it's slower, it breaks up the rhythm of the other 3 lines. And there are rhymes also at the end of lines 2 and 4, sometimes weak. Sometimes, because she's certainly very familiar with the Bible from the age of 13, if not younger, I find myself asking, what text might she have in mind? Or might she be reflecting on? And of course, the obvious text is Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1, and I'm reading, of course, from the King James Version, which is the version that she used. Now, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. And you can see how that has influenced the poem. In stanza 1, the bridge has no supports. It's pierless. It has no piers. It's just a bridge up in the air. And it takes us from the visible to the invisible world. But it itself is invisible, just to complicate things. The bridge itself. Pierless, of course, is a bit of a play on words too. I think it's a homonym, isn't it, where it sounds like peerless, wonderful, without an equal. And I think that's also intended in the use of that word. But the main thing is that it has no supports. But stanza 2, in case we're a bit worried, we're reassured by stanza 2. It's as strong as steel. It holds you tight. You don't need to be afraid. If you've ever climbed a high bridge, and I mean, I drive over the West Gate, and it does sway. It is a bit scary to be up there, especially when the traffic stops. But this holds you like steel. This is an incredibly strong bridge. And at the end of it is the veil, which takes us into the next stanza, where things become a little more complicated. To what could we presume? Well, she won't say what is on the other side. We can't, she says, say. We can't presume to say, because if we did, the bridge would cease to be. It would cease to be a first necessity, a necessity for us, for our far vacillating feet. Another beautiful phrase, far vacillating feet. It would no longer, why? Because it would no longer be faith. It would no longer be faith. But despite this precarious nature of the bridge, the fact it's invisible, the fact that it has no piers supporting it, or pillars supporting it, it is nevertheless necessary for us, precisely because we are in constant, meandering, undirected. Our far vacillating feet makes that bridge a necessity for us. Now, Calvinism was very clear and definitive, especially 19th century Calvinism in the US, was very clear and definitive on the afterlife. It was simple, heaven and hell, and nothing in between. Completely rejected the notion of purgatory, completely rejected the notion of praying to or through the saints. But the poem challenges that certitude of Calvinism, those propositions. We can't know, we shouldn't even try to know. Otherwise, it's not really faith. We've undermined faith being the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen, as Hebrews puts it. Now, modern secular readings have a bit of a field day with Emily Dickinson because they love to see themselves in her, and I think they misjudge her sometimes as a consequence. There are some readings that see it as, psychologically we need it. We need some sort of sense of that there's some sort of certainty there, even if we can't see it. But I think it's much more likely that Emily Dickinson, the poet, sees it as lying beyond words. We might get the words wrong and then we'll destroy it. It will cease to be faith. So to try and put it into words could be a serious mistake. And I don't think it's so much sceptical about another world as some more modern readings, contemporary readings suggest, but something that's closer to, if she had the language for it, which of course she didn't, what we call apophatic mysticism. That is, she's certainly mystical, there's no question about that, all the transcendentalists were. But apophatic, there's a contrast between the apophatic and the cataphatic. And the cataphatic means putting into words, and the apophatic means saying we can't put into words. So in theology, you get a whole lot of things about God being invisible. What God is not is the only way in which we can define God. We can't really put God into words, and therefore we have to say what God is not. That's apophatic mysticism, and that's what she is, I think, moving towards by saying that no words can, in fact, the words might even be dangerous. Let us be wordless, and we'll see that in a moment. But this poem, I think, has another function. It's not just a statement about belief, about faith, but it's also a rationale for the poetry, the modus operandi of the poet. That's in a way what the poem does, what the poet does, just like in the first poem, telling the truth slantwise. And so her poetry is concerned with this pierless bridge. Well, let's move on to another poem, and I assume some of these might be familiar to you, and that this is her most famous poem probably, which I wasn't going to include, and then somebody said to me, people will be upset if you don't, so I've included it. And it's called Hope. What number is that? Let's hope it's here. 14. Thank you, Michael. So, hope is the thing with feathers. Written, I haven't put the year down, I've got it here, 1862. Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. And sweetest in the gale is heard, and sore must be the storm that could abash the little bird that kept so many warm. I've heard it in the chillest land and on the strangest sea, yet never in extremity it asked a crumb of me. This is probably a more accessible poem of hers. It's tetrameter followed by trimeter, so it's 4 syllables followed by 3. It's been pointed out, I think everyone points out, that many of her poems follow the cadences of hymns. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saves a wretch like me. 4 feet, 3 feet. I once was lost, but now I'm found. 4 feet. Was blind, but now I see. 3 feet. So she uses the metre often of the hymnody, and incidentally, Amazing Grace was a particular favourite in the 19th century, and even in Calvinist circles, which had begun to use hymns, although originally they'd only used psalms. So the basic image is that hope is a bird. There's a lot of bird imagery in her poetry, but the imagery is stretched. and it's wonderful the way we see it stretched. Now, there's, of course, a strong biblical background for this focus on a bird. There's the dove in the story of the flood in Genesis 8, which returns with an olive branch in its mouth, indicating that the flood is over and that vegetation has started to grow again. The Holy Spirit is presented as a dove, a bird, in the stories of Jesus' baptism in all four Gospels, in Mark 1:10 in the earliest Gospel. And then we also have the image of a mother bird as protective, and I think there's something here that really particularly relates to the poem. Psalm 91 verse 4 talks about that, and Jesus picks that up in his laments over Jerusalem, his lament over Jerusalem, where he depicts himself as a mother bird. How often would I have been a mother bird? He said, if only you had come to me for protection. And that's in Matthew 23 and also Luke 13 in more or less the same form. So that mother bird as protective may lie behind this poem. So, stanza 1, the bird perches in the soul as if on a tree, and there is constantly singing. A constant song, but note, no words. No words, just the music. That itself is, I think, quite subversive. Only an unceasing melody in the third line, that's that beautiful line. Stanza 2, well, context now is of a storm, and that's where I think the imagery begins to be stretched. It's a wind blowing in a gale, and yet the bird keeps on singing. I don't know what you know about birds, but I do not think birds are singing in gales, literally. It's sweetest because it's when we need it most, when we're going through our own internal storms. Nothing can suppress or shame this small bird that has protected so many, kept so many warm. This is an absolutely beautiful stanza, this one, but with this stretched imagery of a bird still singing in a storm. And stanza 3 follows immediately on from it. I've heard it in the chillest land, not chilliest, but chillest land, more vivid. And unfamiliar seas, strange places, dangerous places, threatening places. The poet hears its voice in those contexts, in harsh situations of extremity, of interior extremity. And yet the bird never even asks for a crumb, as birds always do. They're always at the back door asking for a crumb, but not this bird. It never wants anything. Again, we're stretching the imagery. Birds do, but not hope. Hope does not ask for anything of us. It's completely, and here I think behind this lies the idea of unmerited grace. It doesn't ask of anything from us, but it's always there and always singing and always providing the hope that it actually is. So hope as irrepressible. You probably, like me, think immediately of that line from Alexander Pope, hope springs eternal in the human breast, which is from a poem which he calls Essay on Man, but it's in fact a rather long poem. And one of the stanzas is about hope, and that famous line comes from that. And she may well have been familiar with that. But also I thought of Romans 5:5, where St. Paul says, and hope maketh not ashamed, because the love of God is shed abroad in our hearts by the Holy Ghost, which is given unto us, again from the King James Version. So there are other allusions there in it, but this is, I think, rightly the most famous of her poems, and is a beautiful image of this rather cute, cuddly little bird that is nevertheless irrepressible, that will not be silenced, but will never speak in words, only in music. That, I think, is itself significant and gets us back to that sense of the apophatic, what can't be, which avoids words, which tries to get away from words. The fourth poem, well, we've done faith and hope, now we have to do love, don't we? I regretted that as soon as I decided on it, because this is quite a difficult poem. Number 6. This is the one that Naomi very kindly added for me, I think, a couple of days ago. Thank you, Naomi. Love. Love is that later thing than death, more previous than life, confirms it at its entrance, and usurps it of itself, taste death, the first, to hand the sting, the second, to its friend, disarms the little interval, deposits him with God, then hovers, an inferior guard, lest this beloved charge need, once in an eternity, a smaller than the large. Well, we go quite well in stanza 1, don't we? Again, we've got the same sort of rhythm as in the previous poem, tetrameter followed by trimeter, the common meter of hymns, which is, I think, I won't try and say what liturgists call it, but it's basically 4 meters followed by 3. It has a biblical background that I noticed a number of secular commentators completely miss, and that is 1 Corinthians 15:55. O death, where is thy sting? O grave, where is thy victory? They are puzzled by the reference to the sting. 1 Corinthians 13, Paul's own great poem on love, of course, and then 1 John 4:7-12, which not only says that God is love, but says that that love precedes everything else. It's prevenient love. It comes before we can respond. Just like a mother loves her baby before the baby is capable of, or a father, capable of responding. So it's prevenient. It comes before any response of ours. And I think that's very much the first verse, the first stanza. It's later than death. It survives beyond death, but it also precedes life, and it's even greater than life itself. It confirms it at its entrance at birth and usurps it of itself. It's not clear whether it usurps life or it usurps death, or both. But basically, it's now abides faith, hope, and love, and the greatest of these is love. That's how Paul ends his poem in 1 Corinthians 13, and I think it's reflected here in this. And then, we have a profound insight into the nature of love, which is certainly Christian, but of course not exclusively Christian. The second and third stanzas are much more difficult stanzas because they're very compressed. Love is prepared to face the sting of death for the sake of a friend, a beloved. In doing so, love disarms the little interval, that is our short span of life, and places the beloved in God's hands, and is happy to place the beloved in God's hands. Stanza 3 is even more difficult, I think. Love hovers over the beloved who has died, offering a lesser guardianship. It's a very complicated idea, but I think it's quite profound. In case they need that guarding, okay, they've gone to that larger realm, but maybe I can offer something small here for them as I sit beside their bed after they're gone. The poet is still hovering over the beloved, still anxious for the other's well-being, even though the other has died and now gone to something much greater. That large something is offering something small, smaller than the large. So, the poem sees love as the beginning and the end of life. It's not the divine will and sovereignty that effects this, but love. And that, I think, stands in considerable tension with the Calvinism of the poet's day. Also, Reformed theology does not encourage hovering over the dead person, let alone praying for them in any sense. But perhaps there's also another dig at Calvinism, or perhaps not a dig. I don't know that it's a dig, but it's offering another way of seeing things. And this offers another way of understanding life and God, and it's from the perspective purely of love. Much more in tune, incidentally, with a lot of modern theology than the Calvinism of her day, or indeed of ours. The fifth poem I thought we'd look at is so we've been pretty happy so far, haven't we? Right, let's go to something a bit grimmer, shall we? Let's make it clear that that is not all of Emily Dickinson's poetry. The Bible is an antique volume. 15, thank you, Michael. This is a later poem of hers, 1882, so not long before her death. The Bible is an antique volume written by faded men at the suggestion of holy spectres. Subjects, Bethlehem, Eden, the ancient homestead, Satan, the brigadier, Judas, the great defaulter, David, the troubadour. Sin, a distinguished precipice others must resist. Boys that believe are very lonesome, other boys are lost. Had but the tale a warbling teller, all the boys would come. Orpheus' sermon captivated, it did not condemn. "16 lines, almost but not quite 4 quatrains. And metre, I won't worry about the metre. Lines 1 to 4 says the Bible is out of date, irrelevant, antiquated, and so also, I imagine, its interpreters. This is a very satirical, almost playful poem, mocking, irreverent. Reference to holy spectres is an interesting one, whether it's the inspiration of the Holy Spirit that the poet has in mind here or not. And it outlines the subjects of the Bible, beginning with Bethlehem. Bethlehem particularly, of course, the birth of Christ. And then it goes on into what seems to be the second quatrain, but follows that list. Eden, the ancient homestead, Satan, the brigadier. These are all Eden, Satan, Judas, David. All of these are random figures, but they're all described in very archaic language. Troubadour, I actually like them. The ancient homestead, it's rather beautiful, but it's also mocking. The brigadier, Satan. The great defaulter, Judas. It's using archaic language to say that all of this stuff is out of date. And then she gets a little more serious here. Sin, a distinguished precipice. Distinguished precipice. This is something really scary. Others must resist. Boys, by boys I think she just means young people. Boys that believe are very lonesome. Those who go through the conversion experience are lonely. Other boys are lost, they're damned. So there you've got election there, those chosen, those not elected. There. And then we go to the last 4 lines, which I think are really telling. Had but the tale a warbling teller, all the boys would come. They'd all come. They'd all love it. Orpheus' sermon captivated. It did not condemn. Orpheus, of course, was the famous bard in the ancient Greek world who could charm not just people but also trees and stones and everything. With the music on his lute was so beautiful that it was captivating, it was enchanting. Of course, there's a long story associated with Orpheus that is not really relevant here. But what's the main difference? Orpheus' sermon, not that he wrote any sermons, he sang songs, but it captivated, it enchanted. It didn't condemn. It did not condemn. That last line is incredibly powerful. In many ways, it says it all. So we're contrasting not just scripture, but also its Calvinistic interpreters, its very moralistic interpreters with Orpheus, with an enchanting singer who does not condemn to hell, who does not condemn people for sin. So a very satirical poem that's aimed at a very moralistic and condemnatory religion, which Calvinism certainly was, that demands, that condemns, without enchantment, without beauty, without delight. A very austere, the austere face, I think, of the Calvinism that was practiced in the 19th century and still is in some circles of the Anglican Church today. And basically a point is, if it had been a better teller, then things would be very different. Now, of course, my own view of this is that there are Orpheuses in the scriptures, not in the interpretation of Dickinson's day or the Calvinism of the day, but I think there are Orpheuses in scripture. So is this poem condemning scripture or its interpreters or both? That's the question we're left with. But what we are left with is that if it is going to affect us, convert us, change us, it's got to enchant us. It's got to be enchanting, beguiling, draw us into beauty and delight, not condemnation. So quite a strong poem there. And another one that's also perhaps somewhat more negative. Of course I prayed. 13, thank you. Of course I prayed. And did God care? He cared as much as on the air a bird had stamped her foot and cried, "Give me." My reason, life, I had not had, but for yourself. 'Twere better charity to leave me in the atom's tomb, merry and naught and gay and numb, than this smart misery. This has an unusual structure, and I think we're moving into sort of something closer to modernism here in this poem with its erratic rhythm, which indicates the 2 feet and sometimes 3, indicating, I think, something of the pain of the poem. It's an angry poem. It's a distressed poem. It's angry against God and God's silence, implying God's indifference. And yet, of course, the scripture tells us that not even a sparrow falls to the ground, a conceit that she uses elsewhere in her poems. Not a sparrow falls to the ground without your father knowing it, but here she gives the ridiculous image of a bird stamping its foot in the air, a sort of childish gesture in a way. But of course, this actually coheres with a long biblical tradition of lament. Psalms of lament, the book of Job, which is lament, and I think has got resonances of Job throughout this poem. These are poems of lament and also anger against God, decrying God for God's absence. So lines 1 to 2 assumes, there's very short, explosive sentences. They assume a conversation with somebody, perhaps with a friend saying, "Did you pray about it, dear?" Or perhaps even a voice inside herself saying, "You ought to pray about it." "Of course I did," is the answer. So it assumes a conversation with someone giving kind but very pietistic advice. In verses 3 to 5, as we've said, we have that rather absurd and childish image of a bird stamping its foot and demanding, "Give me," but of course unnoticed as if a bird was to do something that ridiculous. Lines 6 to 7 changes now into dialogue with God directly. "My reason, life, I had not had, but for yourself." This is addressed now to God, you language. The speaker acknowledges that she's received everything from God, her reason, her life itself. And frankly, that doesn't help. It makes it worse, as the remaining 4 lines make clear. "'Twere better charity, if you really are on about love, this is what you should have done. To leave me in the atom's tomb, unformed, merry and naught and gay and numb." What a series of adjectives. Merry, happy, gay, happy, but also nothing and numb, not feeling anything. "I would have been happier then," she's saying. Of course, she wouldn't have been happier, or maybe she would, because she's not feeling the pain anymore. So it's the numbness that's the point here, the numb, than this smart misery. Smart is a very unusual adjective here. It suggests perhaps smarting pain, pain that smarts, but it's also intelligence, because she's talked about reason. Her intelligence can see all too clearly the silence of God and what that means for her and where that leaves her, stuck, caught in her misery, able to understand it, to give a rationale, to reason, but still not able to change it, completely helpless. So it's a very angry and bitter poem, a poem of lament addressed directly to God. And as I've said, it's got resonances of the book of Job, the whole book of Job, until God steps in at the end and decides to have a say in this, which in which, incidentally, God answers none of Job's questions. Job curses the day that he was born, but refuses to curse God. And that's what she's doing here. She's cursing the day she was born. She's not cursing God. It's an expression, in other words, though a hard one, of faith. It's an expression of faith. In Mark's Gospel, Jesus dies, and also Matthew, my God, why have you abandoned me? And the number of commentators that say, oh, he doesn't really mean that. He means the end of the psalm where he's all happy again and it's thanksgiving. That's what he means. He's just saying, oh, read the whole psalm. Don't focus on this one line. That is absolute rubbish. It is a cry of despair, of desolation. And this too is a poem of bitter anger and desolation at the absence of God. Right, I want to do one more poem, just because she is a nature poet, and I haven't actually looked at really any nature poems, so let's have a look at one. Nature is what we see. 16, thank you. This was written in 1863. Nature is what we see: the hill, the afternoon, squirrel, eclipse, the bumblebee. Nay, nature is heaven. Nature is what we hear: the bobolink, the sea, thunder, the cricket. Nay, nature is harmony. Nature is what we know, but have no art to say, so impotent our wisdom is to her simplicity. Oh, right, are you? Oh, my fault. Sorry, Naomi. Yes, let me read the first verse again, the first stanza again. Sorry, I realise I'm not talking about the Bible. I can't talk about verses. Stanzas. Nature is what we see: the hill, the afternoon, squirrel, eclipse, the bumblebee. Nay, nature is heaven. So you need to add that, nay, nature is heaven. Nay, dash, nature is heaven. Okay. So 3 quatrains, with the first and third stanzas following the pattern. Stanza 2 is a bit more irregular. There's no strong rhyming in this poem. There are a lot of poems that are about nature, and Dickinson loved her garden. She loved looking out at the birds and her garden, and occasionally, if she could get out of her room, go for a walk in it. But it celebrates the variety and diversity of nature. Why nature is in inverted commas is a good question, but Dickinson often does that, or sometimes does that in poetry, puts something in inverted commas for reasons that you might be able to work out. So what it means, what nature means to our senses and our knowledge. So we move from sight, stanza 1, to hearing, stanza 2, to knowledge, stanza 3. What we see, what we hear, what we know. There's a progression. But there's also a paradox in each stanza. The poet is speaking of earthly things that we see: hills, afternoons, squirrels, eclipses, bees, random collection of things. Yet these are all earthly things, yet it's described as heaven. Nay, it's heaven. This is heaven here. This is heaven on the earth. So there's a paradox there. Secondly, in the second stanza, this poet is describing very different sounds we hear with nothing in common for our ears. A bird, bobolink, is a little blackbird that flies enormous distances and makes the most beautiful sound, quite loud. So the bobolink, the bird, the sound of the sea, the sound of thunder, the sound of a cricket, an insect. These are random sounds, but nay, it's harmony. Somehow these very disparate sounds blend into one, into a beautiful harmony. And the third stanza goes in a somewhat different direction, as you would expect from Dickinson's poetry. The poet here is describing what we know but cannot speak. Our wisdom, our knowledge, the very sophistication of our language is powerless. The complexity of our language is powerless and rather pathetic in comparison to nature's simplicity, the incredible simplicity of nature. So nature is what we think and hear, but it also has a transcendent quality to it. It's beyond, it's heavenly, it's beyond our ability to describe, to put into words. And here the adjective I want is ineffable. Ineffable, unable to be spoken of, unable to be put into words, beyond the power of words. Even nature, even what we see and hear is beyond our capacity. And that's why you have this sense of sort of staccato with the hill, the afternoon, squirrel, eclipse, the bumblebee, the bobolink, the sea, thunder, the cricket. You know, these random things express the poet's inability to articulate, and yet, of course, she does articulate. So there's a profound paradox in that, in every stanza of that poem. Okay, well, they were the only poems I was explicitly going to talk about. There are others there that you might like to look at. And let me just briefly comment on one or two of them. Because I Could Not Stop for Death is one of her most famous poems, and it's quite clear here that we cannot assume the speaker to be the poet. We need to speak about the speaker here. So it's death as it's a ridiculous image, a very playful image, a daring image of death, not as a sort of hideous spectre, but as a kindly Victorian gentleman who actually comes for you in his carriage and looks after you, and he kindly stopped for me. She doesn't want to die, but death has come to her and very kindly taken her on a journey which takes her through the various stages of life, childhood, the ripening corn, sunset, the grave, the house that seemed is of course the grave, the tomb. And then she says that, or the speaker says that centuries ago I realised that horses were heading for eternity. So it's a very complex, actually apparently simple but very complex poem about death and the inevitability of eternity. Must Be a Woe, the fourth one, is an explicit reference, which is rare, to the cross. An explicit reference to the cross, which she also sees as kind of a slant way of telling the truth, and she's absolutely right about that. And it reminds me of 1 Corinthians chapter 1, where Paul speaks about the weakness of the cross, the folly of the cross, which is wiser than the wisdom of human beings. Fifth poem is David and Goliath rewritten. It's a rather sad poem, actually. So the poet imagines herself as David going forward, all confident like David, but she's the only one that falls. She doesn't know it's because Goliath was too big or she was too small, but it actually didn't work in her case. And that, I think, is a very powerful metaphor for some of her poetry. I'm Nobody. I mean, it's a very humorous poem, but it's also sad. I'm nobody. Who are you? Are you nobody too? Oh, goody, there's a pair of us. Don't tell, they'd advertise, you know. How dreary to be somebody. How public, like a frog, to tell one's name, the lifelong June, that's all through summer, to an admiring bog. Because I think it's very simple and rather beautiful. If I can stop one heart from breaking, I shall not live in vain. If I can ease or cool one fainting robin unto his nest again, shall not live. In that funny direction stanza, because she's talking about, you know, but nest again, and I'm understanding. something about one need not be a poem. Haunted. The brain has far safer external ghost. Hunting that cooler through an abbey gallop. Moonless one's our self encounter in lonesome place. Our self carries a revolver. He bolts the door, overlooking a superior spectre more near. Complicated poem, but actually it's a very simple message. It's to say that ghosts are all very well in their own way and pretty scary. There's nothing as scary as your own self. There's nothing as scary as your interior self. And it reminds me of those words of oh, the mind has mountains, frightful, sheer, no man fathomed. You know those poems, those lines from one of Gerard Manley Hopkins' poems, where he says, the mind has mountains, frightful, sheer, no man fathomed. Call them cheap may who ne'er hung there. Talking about the agony of the interior self, the self behind the self. This is Emily Dickinson's equivalent, I think, to those lines of Gerard Manley Hopkins. The really frightening thing is your own self, when you encounter your own self. And I think it's an incredibly... The thing about her poetry is it's so unbelievably honest. It's so brutally candid. It says things that most of us would rather not say or hear. Thank you very much. But it says them. It's completely transparent in that sense. And yet it's also carefully written, carefully constructed. It's not a spontaneous outpouring. It's a very carefully written... reminds me of Julian of Norwich. You know, her revelations of divine love. You know, she wrote them, 20 years after she actually experienced these visions? Or like the book of Revelation, which seems to be an ecstatic outpouring of mystical experience. It's not. Well, it may be, but it's, as we have it now, it's very carefully constructed. And the same with her poetry. This is not just a mirror on experience. It's a very structured piece of art. It tells the truth slantwise and is very carefully constructed. Okay, let me close with a couple of brief theological reflections. So even in resistance, subversion, doubt, there's a deep spirituality in the poems. Even when the Calvinism of her day is sifted out, there remains a deep spirituality, a strong belief in God, in the soul as immortal, the soul as destined for eternity. It goes alongside a very deep love of nature, which is typical of the Romantics and also the Transcendentalists, and sometimes seems to sit very uneasily with it in her poems, especially in relation to death. I think the poems struggle with that the earthiness, the beauty of the earth, and the destiny of eternity. There's no resolution. I think modern theology does have a resolution for that. And not just modern theology, but I think theology that's not Calvinist has a resolution with the notion of the resurrection. But that's not part of her worldview or poetic point of view. At the same time, there's not a strong content to her faith and spirituality. There's no real notion of resurrection, for example, that materiality, that matter itself is redeemed. It's not part of her theological culture. She is something of a mystic. But unlike the medieval women mystics of the Middle Ages, they have a theological and ecclesial framework in which they work. That sometimes sits uneasily with them, but they are still within that framework. which is why a number of them, of course, apart from Julian, are actually saints, and an occasional one or two doctors of the church. But she does not have that theology, that spirituality that will enable her to embrace something that's definitively Christian in terms of mysticism. In some ways, I think her poetry is closer to deism. There's a belief in God in the poems, but it's perhaps closer to a Unitarian view, as the Transcendentals were. Unitarians, as I said at the beginning, who are a form of Christian faith, if you'd call it Christian, there's a big dispute about that, who don't really believe in the Trinity or the deity of Christ. They take Christ seriously, but not as divine, and nothing particularly sacramental. So she's deprived of an environment without, I think, an authentic Christian mysticism and without authentic Christian liturgy and sacramentality. And I think as a result, that's why it's so easy in some ways for secular writers to embrace her, and really, why shouldn't they interpret her in their own way? But I think they miss the sense of God as necessary, as faith as necessary, of eternity as necessary in her spirituality. But it's an uneasy spirituality, and I think it's uneasy precisely because it's in reaction against the Calvinism of her day. Thank you.
We have about 10 minutes if you're prepared to answer a question or two, if anyone has one. We have one over here. I'll just bring the microphone to you so that we can all hear it.
Thank you so much, Professor. I think you have really given a penetrating analysis of the poet's apprehension of the true nature of reality, despite the trappings of her cultural, religious context.
Yep.
And I'm just wondering, has anyone done a study of her work in the context of, say, more Asian philosophies like Taoism or Buddhism? Because some of the themes you picked up seem to mention, the Tao that can be named is not the Tao.
Yes.
The wordless nature of understanding reality.
Yep.
And the 5 elements appear quite often in her imagery. Water, earth, fire, and so on. And the final one I wanted to say was the emphasis on harmony and compassion and almost the nature of paradox. So these to me resonate very much with Buddhism.
Yep.
Thank you so much.
That's a great question. I'm not an expert on the secondary literature, but I am aware that the Transcendentalists were influenced by Hinduism and Hindu ideas. That's not quite what you're talking about, but it's not dissimilar. So there was Asian influence in their thinking. So it's not at all surprising that you would see the resonances of it. Yeah. Thank you for that.
Anyone else? I'd like to thank Dorothy in particular because I love the poems and I now understand a bit better why, I think, as you've unwrapped a whole lot of things there. Yeah. And I was reminded while you were talking of a phrase from another Unitarian from Boston, Henry James, who was incapable of being as concise as this, but who did talk about the pain of consciousness. And it's a good phrase, I think, and there's a lot of that in here, isn't there?
There's a lot of it in there,
yeah.
And I think, I was brought up on Louisa May Alcott, and I was brought up a very strict Calvinist, and there were parts of her books that shocked me, which is where she had a very universalist view of salvation and so on. But she's part of that same mental world, that philosophical world, I think, as Emily Dickinson. I'm just sad that in the end, Emily Dickinson could not find a home, an ecclesial home. I remain sad about that. Now, maybe if it had been presented to her, she would have rejected it, But I think if there'd been an ecclesial home for her that was open-hearted, that was grounded in love, that had belief in the resurrection of matter, of material reality, and that was truly incarnational and sacramental, giving oodles of space for mysticism, she might have actually found a home and maybe been less of a recluse than she was.
Thank you again very much, Dorothy.
Oh, thank you.
And I imagine Dorothy may be prepared to speak to you on the way out as you leave us.
Absolutely.
So she'll make her way